Nosferatu is here.
The source material for Eggers' fourth feature is apparent.
I am Dracula.
And nods to Murnau's original abound. Yet somehow this film manages to tread a path all its own. Which brings me to one particular collaboration I want to focus on.
Jared and I are always trying to push each other. And one of the great things about that is that motivates you to do it better the next time.
The Knights of Nosferatu, while definitely referential, actually share most of their DNA with this duo's prior work.
Boo!
The Witch marked cinematographer Jarin Blaschke and Robert Eggers' first feature collaboration. And it's here we begin to witness some early hallmarks of their style. Lighting is always motivated. For day interiors, this means primarily window light. Exteriors are almost exclusively overcast. The color palette is desaturated and contrast quite low, but it's the night work where things really begin to develop.
We must find some light in our darkness.
Bolstered by the sensitivity of a digital sensor, night interiors are just about exclusively flame, sometimes with multiple sources in the shot, and other times just one. And Blaschke isn't afraid to let the frame fall off into darkness. Of course, all of this is perhaps supported by a few triple-wick candles just out of frame.
Thomasine, didst not bed them down before supper?
And then there's the night exteriors. Upon reflection, Blaschke has lamented the conventional movie night approach he was forced to take, which became unavoidable due to the constraints of the shoot. And while I personally take no issues with the look, it's against the purest approach Blaschke will hone on later films. The moonlight, supplied by two REM series HMIs, is dimmed considerably so that the real flame, in Thomason's lantern, plays at a believable level. Bounced fill at a low wattage completes the look. And it's these ratios that help sell the believability. But ever the stickler for consistency, one lit night meant all the night scenes had to be lit. Which, when it came to scenes with rain, were in Blaschke's words an unnatural necessity, seeing as there would be no hard light on a rainy night. Reflecting on the production in Filmmaker Magazine, he commented, "Realistic night scenes are where I will spend a lot of my efforts and brainpower as budgets become a little less restrictive. And much of The Witch's production would be a valuable lesson for the next film," which, according to a 2015 Deadline announcement, was set to be Nosferatu. But as is common in Hollywood, the film was shelved. As for what was next, a post from Blaschke on the Fotrio forums from December 15, 2017, gave us a bit of a clue. He was prepping a period-set black and white motion picture with a desire to create an orthochromatic look. Noting there's no orthochromatic motion picture film, he was looking to create the tonality with filtration, a hard chop of all the wavelengths longer than about 580 nanometers. Blaschke ended the post asking, "What is my best choice as far as filtration?" Of course, we now know the film in question was The Lighthouse, and some aspects carry over from The Witch. Again, we find pools of light illuminating the central action and letting all else fall away. Light is always motivated, a purist approach that's a cornerstone of Blaschke's work.
Is that frame? Frame.
For day interiors, that means a lot of bounce light coming through windows.
Action.
Goddamn drunken, horse-shitting, short, shit liar. A liar.
While night interiors are staged around oil lamps, with halogen bulbs to augment what's actually there. However, The Lighthouse marked a much more graphic look, stemming from the low-contrast lessons learned on The Witch. Blaschke is still playing on the edge of the negative. He's not afraid of a dark image, but he's much more careful with ratios. Scenes may be dark, but there's always some highlight carving out the image. And speaking of the negative, in a distinct shift from the digital capture of The Witch, this film marked the duo's return to film. Specifically Kodak XX, which is black and white. It doesn't see color, but that doesn't mean it's not color sensitive. Take a red rose. It's rendered gray. More light, and it's rendered a brighter gray. But what if the film stock can't see red? This would be an orthochromatic response, exactly what Blaschke was after. But XX is not orthochromatic. And how a film renders colors is dictated by its sensitivity to the visual spectrum of light, its spectral sensitivity, which Kodak publishes for each of their stocks. XX, like all modern motion picture film, is panchromatic, meaning it's sensitive to all wavelengths of visible light. But importantly, it's not equally sensitive to all those wavelengths. Notice the little peak between violet and blue before the dip between blue and green? This is why spectral sensitivity curves are important. They tell us how a particular stock, even black and white, will respond to the spectrum of light, or what we see as color. But Blaschke was after an orthochromatic look restricted to blue and green, not the pink chromatic response of XX. So how do you do it? Well, it's purely complementary. If you want to filter red from an image, you use red's complement, cyan. Opposing colors are darkened while making corresponding colors relatively brighter, which makes it sound easy, but right there in the credits we find an important acknowledgement to Ron Angvelson, the filter's creator, who, in an Instagram post, described the filter's creation as a technical challenge of colossal proportions. And Angvelson knows a thing or two about filtration, creating the filters used by Hoyte van Hoytema on Ad Astra and Nope, as well as more recently for Greg Fraser's use on Dune Part 2. For Blaschke's use, this meant a hard cut right around 570 nanometers, or mid-yellow. It's an effect best recognized when looking at the behind-the-scenes content from the film.
Shake a little bit, Rob. Say, I am.
I am!
Note how a warmer toned sweater
I'll drop you down a few feet.
is rendered darker in the film. It's even more apparent when looking at Defoe's outfit, where longer wavelengths like red and yellow are rendered much darker in the final frames. Blue skies are bleached. We never quite get a sky like the one found in the film's promotional material, and blood is rendered black. Well, until it isn't. In an old Hollywood sleight of hand, the black and white film's color sensitivity is changed right in the middle of a take, as the blackened red brightens until it nearly disappears. It's the inverse of a similar technique used on the transformation sequences of 1931's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And on the Lighthouse, this meant a cyan gel on the light was slowly switched over to red, which freely let its own wavelengths pass, therefore overexposing red. And this creative use of filtration would become integral to Blaschke's process. In a final post on Photrio, he noted, "Currently for our next film, I'm finding very interesting results using the Lighthouse filter with color film for particular uses I can't talk about yet. Stay tuned."
Hear of a prince's vengeance quenched at the fiery gates of hell. A prince destined for Valhalla.
The Northman served as a bit of a breakthrough. In an interview with British Cinematographer magazine, Blaschke cited the influence of The Lighthouse, stating, "This film wouldn't exist in this form without The Lighthouse. Even though that's black and white, it has a night texture to it and is similar in the way the skin tones separate from other elements. The focus on this film was all about exaggerating that texture and bringing it into color. And this night texture on color film is where filtration got really interesting."
2, 1, action.
The Northman signaled a continued commitment to film, but this time more modern Kodak Vision 3 color negative, with a preference for slower stocks. And back to our spectral sensitivity curves, we actually find 3 curves, one for each of the separate emulsions, which happens to emulate, though not perfectly, the way our eyes perceive color. However, a distinct shift in our visual acuity occurs in levels of low luminance like night. Our photopic cone-mediated vision switches over to scotopic rod-mediated vision. Essentially, our sensitivity narrows to an almost monochromatic range of mostly blue light, and we become insensitive to longer wavelengths like red. Which brings to mind a certain rose. Blaschke had already cut the spectrum once on black and white stock, and it turns out, on the Northman, this removal of red acted as a near-perfect stand-in for the shift in our visual acuity that happens at night. A modified version of the Lighthouse filter was made and aptly named the scotopic filter, which is a topic we've explored before in our very first upload to the channel. But I think it's important to revisit how spectral sensitivity factors into this concept.
Even though your brother stole my eyes, I see you.
With the filter, the red layer of film remains unexposed, with a weaker exposure in green and a strong exposure in blue. And you can see the effect where scenes have a desaturated, almost monochromatic silver sheen with a tonal contrast more indicative of night. But it's not just the color that's important, it's also the quality of light. Notice how these shadows are sharp. These ratios, intentional. From ambient starlight fill to convex mirror standing in for the moon, and a pretty extensive backlight wash, Blaschke's lighting design on the Northman is taking his motivated approach to new extremes, which brings up an important facet of his technique. Blaschke doesn't just want a version of moonlight. He wants to get as close as possible to the real thing. On Nosferatu, moonlight is back in a big way, but ever the stickler for authenticity, Blaschke can't help but point out when the illusion doesn't quite meet his standards.
I mean, if you look at the moon, the shadows don't make sense. Obviously, the moon's in the shot, which doesn't make sense for these. If you go back a bit, yeah, like this shadow is bullshit. But the lamp was there, but the thing is that the lamp is much closer than the moon, which is essentially at infinity, which would throw a shadow way back here. But the lamp's there at, 200 yards or whatever, so when it's that close, all the shadows go sideways.
Thanks to the lovely breakdown by VFX studio Blue Bolt, we don't have to imagine what Blaschke's talking about. There's clearly a light here, a stand-in for a moon, being flagged off the lens to mitigate flare. Some amazing CG extensions expand the mountain pass, and a LiDAR scan of Hunadora Castle completes the effect.
This is full CG. This is a LiDAR scan of Hunadora Castle in Romania.
If it looks good, the audience will forgive you.
Yeah, I think it looks all right.
All right is an understatement. I think these are some of Blaschke's most evocative night exteriors yet. And in the crossroads scene, you can see just how far he's pushing this technique. It marks a return of the scotopic filter with a bit more blue added in the grade. And we find similar ratios to those used on the Northman. Two Arimax 18Ks key the scene at 2 stops under, providing the sharp graphic edge that contours the details of the frame. Toppy skylight fill at around 3.5 stops under is coming from a balloon overhead, and finally a 20 by behind camera wraps the light just enough to allow us to peer into the shadows. And if the ratios seem close, it's because his exposure is getting into the toe of the negative's characteristic curve. It's how Blaschke's getting a scene that feels dark but isn't underexposed, a lesson learned between The Witch and the Lighthouse. In that way, Nosferatu represents a culmination of all that's come before it. It marks the return to real flame and candlelight, like The Witch, but this time on film.
It's very satisfying to shoot on film and have real candles.
An exposure by fire necessitated some changes. For one, this film was shot entirely on Kodak 5219, a faster stock. And the Panaflex Millennium XL2 used on prior films was traded in for the increased mirror clearance of the Aricam ST and LTs, which was necessitated by new custom T1.1 ultra-fast lenses. But Blaschke is still sticking to his tenet of believability, always augmenting what's there. While on the Northman, bulbs accentuated fire in the shot, on Nosferatu, nothing electric ever stood in for flame. Blaschke instead got creative with mirrors. And considering so much of the film was produced on sound stages, mirrors would play an important role, which led Blaschke to ask, how far away do you have to put an 18K to make an artificial source look like the real thing?
Jarin's always thinking about what would the actual light source be, So there's lots of actual using candlelight and, perhaps while it may seem extreme, trying to get light from very far away or using mirrors to reflect light to create, the kind of distance that would look more like a more naturalistic moonlight in a room or whatever.
Blaschke's going to great lengths, not just refining color, but also the quality and direction of the light. For emulating moonlight, this means as far away and high up as he can manage. But on sound stages, where distance is a luxury, mirrors became an important tool. They allow him to achieve the believability of the relative size of the moon, but with an artificial source. However, Blaschke also brought back a trick from the Northman.
There's something else interesting here. Jarin, the DP, his lighting of this moonlight lighting, he used a concave or convex mirror in the sky that he bounced the light off of to create it. This was something you developed on the Northman too, right?
Yeah, to basically get like a light ray that is closer to the large size that would come from like the moon.
Was it a concave or a convex?
Vex.
Convex. I could draw that. But you get the idea.
The mobile convex mirror moons were back, here helping shape the shadows and silhouettes that are so important to the film. In one silhouette in particular,
Is the shadows in the curtains.
That is bullshit.
Perfectly illustrates why none of this would be possible without his fellow collaborators. It's from the film's opening, A Oneer, another Eggers and Blaschke signature.
Come to me.
Where in a matter of a 270-degree sweep, we go from a close-up
Come to me.
to a developing medium, and finally land in a wide. And that's not a move you can do without some help from your fellow heads of department. First, from production designer Craig Lathrop. Because when a crane base is in a bedroom, you're going to need to move some walls. A move we can just about make out in this behind-the-scenes frame. And from these curtains, which are on this wall, from this frame in the finished film, we know exactly which wall is in motion, which is how you get the camera to this position in the final frames. But these oneers can be deceiving.
I would challenge that there's not a lot of editing in this film, though, because there's lots of editing in those oneers.
That's editor Louise Ford, another constant across Eggers' work. And so frequently with a shot like this, people mention how they noticed the cut, right there in the pan when the screen goes black. But what's often unnoticed is how editing isn't merely about the cuts.
So much of her work is invisible, you know what I mean?
From speed retimes to dialogue slipping and even some split-screen compositing, much goes on in the pacing of these oneers that's unseen. Perhaps there's no cuts in the opening, but that doesn't mean it's not edited. And speaking of invisible work...
Yeah, hopefully, I'm glad that it's invisible. Like Angela, our visual effects supervisor, what's her title, Rob? Supervisor. She's always like thankful that people are like, there's barely any visual effects in the movie. Well, of course, there's tons and tons of them, but it's the best compliment if you think there isn't any.
It's 80% of the shots have VFX in them.
No kidding.
Various. That's what Angela said at the Q&A the other night, so I'm going to take her word for it.
Which brings us back to the shadow.
Yeah,
Okay.
that is VFX because
Okay.
when you're talking about white curtains right next to right on the window, I can't build a shadow there without messing up the beginning of the shot.
Sure.
It's a scene again bathed in Blaschke's signature moonlight wash, where we'd be remiss without mentioning costume designer Linda Muir's careful choice of a white nightgown, which perfectly plays in the gradations of light and dark. Which, when taken all together, is why I think, well, this shadow, Megget compared to this shadow, Eggers' Nosferatu is truly something all its own.